Let me tell you something strange about the word sorry in modern life. We live in a world where apologies have become reflexive. Someone bumps into you, you say sorry. You ask a question, you start with sorry. You express an opinion, you end with sorry. There are people who apologize for taking up space, for speaking, for simply existing. You might even know someone like that. Maybe you are someone like that. And here's the question that always lingers beneath those automatic apologies. Why? Why would someone constantly apologize when they haven't done anything wrong, when they're simply being human? It's easy to assume that people who over-apologize are just polite or considerate, but that's not the full picture. Beneath the surface, there's an entire psychology at play, one that speaks volumes about self-worth, childhood conditioning, and the invisible weight of trying to keep everyone else comfortable. See, for some people, sorry isn't just a word. It's a shield. It's a preemptive defense against conflict, rejection, or disapproval. Because whether we admit it or not, chronic apologizing has subtly become a way some people navigate the world. It minimizes confrontation. It softens presence. And yet, those who apologize constantly are often the ones carrying the heaviest emotional burdens. They absorb blame that isn't theirs. They shrink to avoid discomfort. They apologize for things that don't require forgiveness. Psychologists have found something fascinating. People who apologize excessively often score higher on traits like hyper-responsibility, people-pleasing, and anxiety. They tend to carry an inflated sense of accountability for others' emotions and reactions. In other words, they aren't trying to be difficult. They're trying not to be a burden. And in a world that often punishes visibility, that makes sense. Because let's be honest, most chronic apologies aren't about politeness. They're about survival. It's an unconscious strategy to stay safe in relationships. Every sorry is a way of saying, please don't be angry with me. Please don't leave. Please don't think I'm too much. But when you apologize for everything, something shifts. You begin to lose your sense of where you end and others begin. You stop trusting your right to take up space. You start believing that your existence requires constant justification. And that's the secret psychology behind people who always apologize. They've learned somewhere along the way that being small keeps them safe. They don't lack manners. They lack the belief that they deserve to exist without permission. It's not about being weak or insecure in the traditional sense. It's about carrying an invisible contract that says, if I apologize enough, maybe I won't be rejected. Because when you've been blamed for things beyond your control, you start apologizing for everything. Silence, emotions, boundaries, even joy. For some, the habit of over-apologizing started in childhood. Maybe they grew up in environments where expressing needs was met with frustration, where making mistakes meant emotional withdrawal, where love felt conditional on being easy, quiet, undemanding. So they learned to say sorry before anyone could accuse them of being a problem. They apologized their way into acceptance. And even now, decades later, that pattern remains, embedded in their speech, woven into their interactions. But here's what's often misunderstood. Constantly apologizing doesn't mean you're kind. It often means you're terrified of being seen as unkind. It doesn't mean you're empathetic. It means you're hyper-vigilant about how others perceive you. There's a concept in psychology called excessive responsibility bias. It's the belief that you're responsible for other people's feelings, reactions, and comfort, even when you're not. And people who apologize constantly are often drowning in that bias. They carry guilt that doesn't belong to them. They apologize for the weather, for traffic, for someone else's bad mood. So people who always say sorry are often protecting themselves from an imagined threat. They keep their presence apologetic, careful, pre-forgiven. And maybe that's not politeness or humility. Maybe it's exhaustion. Because think about it. When was the last time you said something without immediately softening it with an apology? When was the last time you set a boundary without feeling the need to say sorry first? That reflex, that need to apologize, is not natural. It's conditioned. It's the product of years of learning that your needs are negotiable, that your feelings are inconvenient, that your presence requires an excuse. And when someone is trapped in that pattern, it feels automatic, but it's also slowly erasing them. They start disappearing behind a wall of apologies, speaking softer, asking for less, believing they're always one mistake away from being too much. In that space, something fragile grows, a kind of self-abandonment that doesn't need witnesses. But not everyone who over-apologizes is doing it from fear alone. Some are driven by deep empathy, the empathy that makes them feel everyone's discomfort as their own. Social psychology has a term for this: emotional contagion. It's the tendency to absorb and mirror the emotions of those around you. And for many chronic apologizers, that's overwhelming. They feel responsible for calming every storm, even the ones they didn't create. So they apologize, not because they did something wrong, but because they feel everything so intensely. They want peace. They want harmony. And ironically, sometimes the people who apologize the most are the ones who've been hurt the most. They're not weak. They're wounded. They just choose softness instead of anger. There's a deep emotional undertone to that constant sorry. In a world that often says, stand your ground, choosing to apologize becomes a form of survival. It's saying, I'd rather shrink than fight. They might notice tension and immediately think it's their fault, nodding, soothing, sometimes aching, but they rarely defend because they understand something painful. Conflict feels dangerous when you've been made to feel like you're always the problem. And when you've been blamed for enough things that weren't your fault, you start apologizing preemptively for everything. Sometimes the most healing thing someone can do is stop saying sorry, unlearn the reflex, and start believing they have nothing to apologize for. And when you've lived through enough of those invisible wounds, you start realizing that apologizing constantly is not kindness. It's survival. It's actually where self-worth gets lost, not expressed. This is where the paradox lies. Apologizing was meant to repair connection, yet it often leaves people feeling more invisible than ever. When you apologize for everything, you stop claiming space and start erasing yourself. You begin noticing that people expect your apologies, that they've learned you'll always back down, that your boundaries come with a built-in sorry attached. That kind of dynamic, quiet, unnoticed, feels heavier, lonelier, and infinitely more painful. And the people who always apologize, they live in that space. They build relationships where they're always at fault. They find themselves shrinking in rooms they belong in. And they let life unfold while constantly feeling like they're in the way. Part of this is also about identity erasure, losing who you are while trying not to upset anyone. When you apologize for everything, you stop knowing what you actually need to apologize for. That's not growth, that's disappearance. And ironically, the same people who apologize the most often have the strongest boundaries they're too afraid to set, but they swallow them, prefacing every need with sorry, every feeling with, I know this is too much. Because real boundaries to them aren't measured in assertiveness, they're measured in how much discomfort they can avoid causing. These are the people who carry everyone's comfort but their own, who accommodate constantly and understand quietly that their own feelings come last. They don't need the world to validate their existence, they just need permission to stop apologizing for it. And maybe, just maybe, in a world so desperate to be right, their apologies aren't weakness. It's conditioning, a pattern learned from being told too many times that they were the problem. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to stop saying sorry when you've done nothing wrong. You know what's fascinating? The longer someone stays trapped in the apologizing cycle, the more they begin to disappear. Their voice gets quieter, their needs feel smaller, their presence feels apologetic. It's as if constantly saying sorry makes you believe you're always in the wrong. Because when you keep apologizing, you stop existing fully. There's a quiet tragedy in moving through life, constantly asking for forgiveness just for being there. You're not thinking about what you want or need, you're just trying to stay safe, acceptable, not too much. And that's something chronic apologizers rarely get to do anymore. But the psychology behind this goes deeper than habit or personality. It's rooted in how our brains process social safety. Every time we apologize unnecessarily, we reinforce a neural pathway that says, I am the problem. Over time, we begin to internalize that narrative. We start thinking in terms of preventing conflict instead of expressing truth. Now, imagine someone who resists that pattern, someone who deliberately chooses to stop apologizing when they have done nothing wrong. That's not rudeness, that's recovery. It takes self-awareness to break a pattern designed to keep you invisible. People who learn to stop over-apologizing often have to rebuild their internal sense of worth, a psychological process, meaning their sense of value comes from truth, not from keeping everyone comfortable. They don't need to hear "it's okay" after every sentence to believe they deserve to speak. And here's what's even more interesting. Studies show that people who reduce their unnecessary apologies often experience a measurable increase in self-esteem and assertiveness. Because when your sense of self is no longer being constantly minimized by your own words, it becomes solid. It becomes real. You're no longer shrinking yourself into something palatable. You're living as yourself in all your messy, imperfect, unapologetic complexity. And maybe that's the real healing, to stand whole in a world that taught you to stay small. But stopping the apologies doesn't always feel empowering at first. Sometimes it feels terrifying. For many, saying sorry became a place where they once found safety, a way to avoid anger or abandonment. There's a subtle emotional panic that comes from not apologizing when you're used to it. You start worrying people will think you're difficult even when you're just being honest. You start fearing rejection even when you know you deserve better. And eventually, some people stay stuck, not out of preference, but out of terror. They realize the world feels safer when they're apologizing. They don't know who they are without sorry as a shield. And they don't trust that people will stay if they stop shrinking. That's one of the quiet truths many carry. We've confused apologizing with caring. We assume that to be good, we must constantly defer. But real goodness doesn't require self-erasure. Some of the kindest things you can do, setting boundaries, speaking truth, taking up space, will happen without a single apology. No sorry, no disclaimer, no shrinking, just presence. And maybe that's what chronic apologizers need to learn most. They know that presence is not an intrusion. It's a right. Because when you stop apologizing for existing, you start remembering who you actually are. You start reconnecting with the parts of you that got buried under guilt, your desires, your voice, your worth. And that's something profoundly powerful in today's world. It's not selfishness, it's self-reclamation. Of course, it's not always easy. There are moments of doubt, of wondering if speaking without apologizing makes you harsh, if you're becoming the difficult person you were always afraid of being. But with time, you start noticing something beautiful. Your worth doesn't require an apology. It's still there, steady, like breath after holding it too long. And maybe that's what real strength looks like. Not the constant apology for existence, but the quiet claim of it. Some people say, if you don't apologize, you're arrogant. But the truth is, the things that define you most rarely need an apology. Your boundaries, your feelings, your space, your voice, they deserve respect, not forgiveness. And maybe that's enough. When psychologists talk about healthy communication, they emphasize authenticity, the alignment between what you feel and what you express. But in the age of people-pleasing, that alignment is constantly distorted. You begin to speak as a version of yourself designed to avoid conflict. So when someone chooses to stop over-apologizing, it might be their way of staying authentic, of preserving that fragile truth between their inner feelings and outer expression. They don't need everyone to be comfortable with their existence to validate that it's real. They don't need to soften every sentence to deserve to be heard. They exist fully and unapologetically. And here's the paradox. Those who stop apologizing often feel life most authentically. They're not distracted by the performance of being easy. They honor truths others avoid. The discomfort of boundaries, the weight of honest feelings, the power of taking up space. They are real, and realness is the rarest courage in a world built on comfort. But sometimes that very authenticity makes them misunderstood. People might label them as difficult, cold, even selfish. Yet, if you look closer, their lack of apology isn't cruelty. It's health. It's the calm that comes from no longer abandoning yourself to keep others at ease. There's a quiet power that comes from not needing to apologize for being human, just understood as worthy. And that's what people learning to stop over-apologizing understand best. They know that not every feeling needs an apology, that some parts of you deserve to exist without justification. Because once you start apologizing for everything, you stop being fully yourself. You belong to comfort, to ease, to the impossible task of never being too much. And maybe some truths are too important for that. So the next time you notice someone who's stopped apologizing unnecessarily, don't assume they've become harsh. Maybe they're just healing. Maybe they found peace in the solid ground of self-worth, the kind not softened by the constant need for forgiveness. Maybe they're the ones who've remembered what the rest of us forgot. That existing doesn't require an apology. That being human doesn't mean being sorry. That sometimes the truest expression of who you are is simply being, without the constant sorry attached. Because in the end, we're not meant to be apologies. We're meant to be people. And the people who've stopped apologizing for existing, they remind us of that every clear, unfiltered, beautifully unapologetic day.